I am joined now by investigative journalist Luke O'Brien. He has covered disinformation and extremism for The Huffington Post, Politico magazine, Deadspin, Wired News, and other publications. Today we're talking about his recent investigation headlined How Republican Politics and Twitter Created Ali Alexander, the man behind Stop the Steal. Luke, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So your article was a really fascinating character study into Ali Alexander, but the main question I had while reading it was like, what's wrong with this guy? Because he seems like someone who has like a chip on the shoulder, not someone who's just merely motivated by money and power. So what do you think really drives him?
Yeah, well, that is actually a question that I always have with these guys, because they do tend to hew to kind of a similar psychological profile, if you will. And, I'm talking about far-right influencers, activists, extremists. So with Ali in particular, Ali Alexander, I would just say first that, there's kind of I went really deep on his ties to a network of bad actors and Republican operatives and the harm that was being caused by that network. And I needed to, and the story was long, but that also often protects some of these guys from a different kind of investigative reporting, which is getting more into their personal backgrounds, examining their childhoods and sort of their psychological journey to radicalization. So I touched on that in this Ali Alexander piece, but I feel like I only kind of scratched the surface, really. So I can't answer too definitively, but what I can tell you from what I saw is that it lines up with things that I've seen in other extremists, and that is that there is some kind of something in their past. It's like a deep ego wound that none of them were really equipped to handle. And they never really healed from, and it changed them and set them on this path toward becoming more radical. So these guys are often, frankly, just like wounded boys who never really either got the love that they wanted or the support that they wanted or the recognition that they wanted. And that usually is what drives them. It does manifest in kind of this lust for power and significance, and often a desire to get money while doing whatever they do. And usually it's anything goes with these guys, to satisfy these psychological needs. But really underneath it all, I think is kind of this need for revenge. And so you're getting into some stuff that is hard to, without being like a psychologist, it's hard to speak to definitively. But with Ali Alexander, if I were doing the full kind of background profile of this guy for like an investigative profile about him rather than so much his network, I would drill down on his childhood. I would drill down on things that he said about his father leaving his family and abandoning him when he was 2 years old. That seems to have affected him deeply, as it would anybody, I'm sure. But his father, very, very interestingly, was an immigrant. He was from the UAE, I believe, and Ali Alexander used to be known as Ali Akbar. And so his father's name was Akbar, and he abandoned the family, according to Alexander, when Alexander was 2 years old. How I would interpret that in terms of what he ended up becoming as an adult is in this way. He threw in his lot early on as a young adult with this movement that is very anti-immigrant, often racist, and after 9/11, totally Islamophobic. And so, if I were doing the armchair analysis, it's kind of bitterness toward the father that sort of propels him in a certain direction. He's become a Christian extremist, which is interesting. He seems to have been looking for a family, for some sense of belonging for his whole life. And who took him in? But the GOP and this network gave him a sense of self-worth. And, he doesn't see that or doesn't care that he's being used in the process.
But this was also a guy who fantasized about being a political operator from a very young age. Even as a teenager in high school, he was thinking about what he would do once he got to Washington.
For sure. Yeah. So, if you go back, to his high school years, you can find blog posts and things that he set up online where he is talking in those terms. One day I'll make it to the heights of Capitol Hill, and oh boy, did he ever on January 6th. But there wasn't this kind of radical tone or edge to it. It was just, here's this really Christian kid in Texas who is very into conservative politics. He came off in high school kind of like, I'm sure a lot of your listeners know the type from high school who was active in high school politics and was just really like a political nerd in high school. But then it keeps going and it gets darker and scarier over time.
As Alexander matured in his career, it seems like he was pretty ahead of the curve, particularly in terms of how he used social media. Like you mentioned in your article, he was an early adopter of Twitter, and he even got his first name @Ali as a handle. So what do you think he saw in Twitter so early on, and how did this platform change the game for political operatives like him?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think he set up his Twitter account just a few months after Twitter launched, even has claimed to be one of the first quote unquote Republican operatives on the platform. It was him and a few other guys. They clearly recognized early on the power that social media platforms had, not only to organize, but also to spread a message outside kind of the parameters of the mainstream media, which are there for a reason. If you're a bad actor and you're trying to spread disinformation, and when he first adopted Twitter, I don't want to, it's like he's evolved quite a bit over the years. So when he first adopted Twitter, it really was more about leaning into this, there's this liberal media bias and we have to find a way to get our message out. And then over time that kind of evolved into just pure disinformation. But I don't know, I think about this a lot when it comes to these influencers and social media and disinformation, because I think the way that these political operatives behave, they've changed in a way that it tracks with how society has changed with social media, because whether you like it or not, the stuff is inescapable now. At most jobs, you can't avoid it. You're even required in some fashion to engage with it. And there are people who have really grown up with this stuff. I think sometimes, they almost have like a different approach to information and the world, and like a brand first approach where they feel like they can warp the world to service their brand. Influencer culture, and I think that it's happened a lot with these political operatives too. So I don't know, like Alexander, for example, it's just made social media has made it so much easier for people like him to engage in kind of not only the sabotage online, disseminate the information instantaneously around the world now to millions, sometimes even billions of people if you have the right megaphone and the right network. And nothing like that has ever existed before. We've had political operatives for as long as there have been politics, really. But they used to kind of operate more in the shadows, and they're sort of like these hatchet men who just get things done. And then we had, the rise of attack ads when television became a big medium. But now with social media, it's somebody who knows how to weaponize this. And has a motive to kind of sabotage our politics can just overnight become a very powerful force in a way that could never happen before. So I think Alexander's really a great example of kind of the dark side of social media and how something like Twitter can be used in deeply malicious ways.
Speaking of using Twitter in malicious ways, Alexander and Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey seem to have a kind of relationship. They spoke frequently, and they're quite open about this, which is kind of unsettling. So how exactly did that relationship happen, and what does it say about how seriously it takes the problem of disinformation and extremism on the platform?
Yeah, well, some of that is a mystery, but I'll do my best to explain. Let me answer the second part of that question first about Twitter taking disinformation seriously on their platform. My experience in covering this stuff for several years is that Twitter is so negligent as to be complicit at this point. The company appears to be run by people who either don't understand what's going on, which is hard for me to believe because it's a data company that employs data scientists, or are okay kind of looking the other way while bad actors use the platform to damage democracy around the world, because there's a lot of money in this, and Jack Dorsey's terrified of being called a censor. It's clear that he's kind of caved to that bad faith messaging that he's been hit with over the years, like a don't censor conservative speech, when we've seen studies that show that conservative speech actually isn't being censored on social media. But he's so scared of being branded that way, it would seem, that Twitter has really kind of allowed a lot of this stuff to happen. And the problem is kind of baked into the business model, I think. I mean, I could point you to large networks of far-right extremists and neo-Nazis that are on the platform right now, after years of us talking about this as a problem, and watchdog groups and journalists, and I would imagine behind-the-scenes law enforcement even going to the company and being like, hey, you got a serious problem here. I'm pointing out specific accounts, specific networks, and yet it just continues to happen. Twitter's kind of allowed. They've looked the other way oftentimes when there's this violence inciting disinformation and extremism flourishing on its platform, which, I don't know what we do about that, because I think Twitter is making money off of their user base, and some of these problems are baked into the business model, and no amount of reputational harm matters really, as long as that money keeps rolling in. So it's going to take, we're going to have to find other solutions to this problem other than just applying pressure through the media or trying to shame Twitter, because they don't seem to feel a lot of shame. Now, about the first part of your question about Alexander's connections to Dorsey. So that's kind of a mystery, how he got to know Dorsey. We have a photograph of them together. We have Dorsey admitting that he sought out Alexander's advice on whether to ban Alex Jones or not from the platform. We have Alexander talking about how he and Dorsey had been in touch for many months, discussing various issues about conservatives on the platform. Dorsey said that a mutual friend introduced them. Now, I don't know who that friend was. I really would love to know. But here's another piece of information that's interesting, and I couldn't get all this in my story. But Alexander has bragged in private conversations about having high-level ties at Twitter for years. And there is a way to kind of date some of this stuff, at least. So a source for me on my story was this journalist in Louisiana. His name is Lamar White Jr. And Alexander was based down in Louisiana for a couple years doing, political stuff and dirty tricks. And he kind of crossed paths with Lamar White Jr. and they sparred a little bit. And at one point, Lamar White Jr. met him for drinks at a bar. And he asked Alexander, hey, there's this Twitter account that I know you control. It's at Louisiana. That's the handle. And Alexander admitted to controlling it at Louisiana, just the state name, right? Which is pretty crazy that Ali Alexander, who, by the way, still has several active Twitter accounts, has that one in his stable. And so I think this journalist in Louisiana was like, hey, shouldn't you turn that over to the Louisiana government or something? Why do you get to control that? And that account was set up in 2015 on Twitter. And that was when Alexander was the digital director for the campaign of this guy, Jay Dardenne, who was the lieutenant governor of Louisiana at the time and was running for governor. So Alexander was his digital director. Now, apparently the Department of Tourism and Recreation, I can't remember the official name, but that is under the lieutenant governor's control. So this account is set up around the time that Alexander is doing work for the guy who controls the Department of Tourism. And Lamar White Jr. said, how did you get this account? And this conversation happened in 2017, and the account was set up in 2015. And Alexander at that time indicated that he had these high-level ties at Twitter, and I think it was one of these discarded accounts. Like somebody had set it up. Maybe I don't know who set it up first, but it wasn't being used, and then Alexander claimed it. I think by using his connections at Twitter. At least that's according to this guy, my source. And so we're talking at least half a decade possibly of him interfacing with high-level people at Twitter. And by 2015, he was starting to radicalize. I mean, he was hanging out around that time or soon thereafter with like Milo Yiannopoulos and other far-right extremists. And it's really, really concerning that this guy who helped organize January 6th would be in close contact with Twitter executives.
It almost seems to me that Twitter actually welcomed the ways in which political operatives use their platform. But they saw it as a great use case as they were building up their business.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to necessarily go that far. I think it's more just this hyper like libertarian attitude towards speech on a platform, and that, you know, anything goes. And by the way, anything goes is also good for business, right? That's sort of the unspoken part of that, because the more conversation, the more outrage, the more users, the more money. And, you know, so it's very easy for, and, you know, like Alexander, as I said in my story, he radicalized in step with his party. So when he first started using Twitter in 2007, 2008, he's not really an extremist. You know, he's like a very conservative, right-wingy type guy. He's getting into Republican politics, becoming an operative. Over time, you know, he's getting more and more extreme. Maybe he doesn't even recognize that he's radicalizing gradually. By the time Trump hits, it's like full bore. But I have a feeling that you know, that's sort of symptomatic of a lot of things that happen on these social media platforms, where people had these accounts and then they just kind of went crazy, you know, and Twitter's like, okay, they're on, like, he had a blue check, you know, maybe he didn't have a blue check, but a lot of these people do have blue checks on Twitter. And what do they do once these people have, like Jack Posobiec is a perfect example of this, actually. Jack Posobiec, a far-right propagandist, got himself a blue check years ago, and nobody really knew too much about who he was. He started spreading around Pizzagate type stuff. And he got more and more extreme, started spreading more and more disinformation. And then Twitter's kind of like in a bind. It's sort of, we've approved this guy, and he's got a huge following now. He's got over 1 million followers at this point. I mean, that's good business for Twitter. So what, like, I'd just love to know. I'd love to be a fly on the wall in those meetings, those high up meetings at Twitter, where it's like, okay, so we got a guy who just, you know, allegedly spread around a fake bomb threat during a BLM protest that resulted in a police response. And should we ban him or not? Oh, he's got over 1 million followers, and people would start sending us death threats. Maybe we don't ban him. You know, it's crazy.
I feel the same way about Cernovich, who's had a blue check forever, and it's just an absolute menace on Twitter.
Absolutely, yeah, he's one of the worst ones, and he's been doing it for years and years and years in plain view, and with Twitter fully aware of this. And I've actually seen Twitter do strange things with Cernovich, where so Cernovich has been beefing for a long time with certain people, and there's this guy Vic Berger who does some very funny videos. I'm sure you've seen him. And Cernovich is kind of like, Cernovich claims that Berger's harassed him. There's no evidence of that at all. It's, in fact, the evidence is all going the other way. And I think Berger sent me some stuff at one point where he had gotten responses from Twitter saying that they had suspended Cernovich for, you know, violating their terms of service. And that was a total lie. Like, this was happening. I was watching it happen in real time. You know, Berger's getting these responses saying, yeah, we're taking action. We're suspending Cernovich. And Cernovich was not suspended. So Twitter appears to have just been straight up lying to this person who was targeted by Cernovich. Yeah, it's just a mystery. It's like, it's how do they do these things, and how, I mean, why do they make these decisions in such a terrible way?
You mentioned how Alexander seemed to radicalize along with the Republican Party. I think this is partly illustrated by the fact that he developed a close working relationship with Representative Paul Gosar, who was very involved in the Stop the Steal campaign. So what do you think it means that we now have elected representatives who work so feverishly to delegitimize elections?
Well, I think it does not bode well for our country. Alexander launched this movement, Stop the Steal, which was kind of a slogan that was coined by Roger Stone in 2016, but Alexander repurposed it for 2020 as a way to invalidate the election results and claim that Biden and the Democrats had stolen the election. And he organized that very quickly on Twitter primarily. and within, I think it was November 4th was the very first protest. So this is an example of kind of what happens online becoming real very quickly, and the power of social media to allow propagandists and influencers and extremists to organize and actually get people into the streets. And Alexander has some experience doing that. So that first protest that happened, Stop Steal protest, was in Phoenix, and Paul Gosar showed up with Cernovich, which I wrote a story about that after that happened, because it was so shocking to see an elected official, a Republican congressman, is down there like riling up an angry mob. There were extremists there. Some of them had guns. A few extremists, I think they were militia members, went into the election center to kind of like this is all disinformation driven, right? And so you've got this congressman down there whipping them up. Crazy.
Yeah, I was actually there in Phoenix outside the Maricopa County Tabulation Center watching all that go down. We saw Charlie Kirk and we saw the Q Shaman, we saw Alex Jones. It seems like there was a call that went out and every single right-wing provocateur just descended upon this particular area.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was the beginning of it. And it was, as I wrote in my story, it was scary right from the start, because you had a mob down there and they were threatening journalists. They were trying to get into the election center. Imagine, it was kind of like a mini version of January 6th without the violence, but they're trying to force their way into where the votes are being tabulated and put a stop to it because they just don't like the results. And so to see a congressman down there whipping up that mob, a guy who has used democracy to get himself into a position where he can undermine democracy. By the way, that is a tactic of the far right. That is absolutely an articulated goal and tactic of a anti-democratic, some people call it neo-fascist movement that has been percolating in this country for some time, often with some serious funding behind it. And so Gosar, he basically put a stamp of approval from Republicans in Congress in a way on Alexander's movement from the very beginning. And that, if you know a little bit about Gosar, that's actually not surprising. I mean, this is a guy whose own brothers and sisters have basically disavowed him and said that he's dangerous. He has open connections to far-right extremist groups, including the Oath Keepers, who were part of, and members of which stormed the Capitol on January 6th. Also, and I always like to point this out because not a lot of people know about it with Gosar, but he was caught on video a couple years ago in London. He had gone over there to support Tommy Robinson, who is a far-right, activist over there in England, who's a violent criminal who works with sort of neo-fascists in England. And Gosar was over there to support him, and he had a dinner where he appeared to be kind of like under the thumb of Steve Bannon, who was there at the dinner with him. And Gosar was dining with a group of some of the most notorious far-right extremist leaders in Europe, people who work with neo-Nazi organizations. And he's sitting there and just, member of Congress. And one of the European nationalist leaders, looking at Gosar, said, we're not sure. We can't quite predict what Trump's going to do. We don't know if he really has our back, but we need more people in Congress. And he's looking right at Gosar, who then looks over to Bannon, kind of defers to Bannon. And Bannon says something like, oh, yeah, don't worry. We got you covered. When you see stuff like this, and you're writing about networks of bad actors, you realize that this anti-democratic network goes all the way to the top in our government. And that was made clear after January 6th. It was made clear when so many Republicans voted to or refused to certify the Electoral College votes based off of disinformation that Alexander was pushing. So my story about him is really about his connections to this bigger network and to mainstream Republican power. And that's what's so scary about all this, because, it's not just some fringe group that just happened along here. mean, this is something that's been in the works for a long time. Alexander is a very useful tool for a bigger machine that is still spinning its wheels here, and still trying to do what it was doing prior to January 6th, which is, work against our democracy.
So what comes next for these people? Now that the political environment has changed a bit, we are, Trump is out of office. We are in a post-January 6th kind of world. So do they still just have their eye on 2022 and the midterms and the next election in 2024?
Of course, yeah, and beyond. Yeah, I mean, Trump may be out of office, but I would argue that it actually is still the Trump era when it comes to Republican politics. And, it's Trump's party. And this machine was built for somebody like Trump, but probably somebody who's a little more effective than Trump, like somebody who could hide his power level a little better than Trump, could work, the system a little better, play the game a little better, deflect criticism a little better. You drop somebody like that, who's more restrained and controlled, but possibly even has more toxic ideology into this machine, and we got major, major problems. And so, people like Alexander, they're not going to stop. I mean, I'm watching him on Telegram and on other platforms. He's been deplatformed from his main account on Twitter, and like a lot of these other leaders of the far right, they've been deplatformed from their main accounts, but they're still going. I mean, they have no intention of stopping here. They don't have another choice, really. I mean, they've committed fully to this, and they still have access to the same resources. They still have access to literally millions of susceptible minds that are out there that believed that the election was stolen. So I think what we're going to see here, or what we're already seeing a little bit, just by default almost, because of the deplatforming, they've gone a little more underground in terms of organization and communication, but they remain undaunted. And in fact, I think they're even more energized by January 6th. And that's been a massive recruitment and radicalization moment for far-right extremists. Even the FBI director was saying so in Congress the other day. And you take a look at the Proud Boys, for example, that group, it's neo-fascist gang that was instrumental in the January 6th attack. I mean, they're tipping more and more into, even harder extremism, more open white nationalism, even neo-Nazism, if you're tracking their channels now, which, it's not happening on Twitter. It's not happening on Facebook, but it's definitely happening out there on Telegram and in other places. So there are thousands of members of the Proud Boys in this country, thousands. And that's just one group. So I think we're very likely to see these people continue to organize, continue to grift. And unfortunately, I think we're also very likely to see some of the more hardcore, violence-inclined extremists continue to plan and carry out kind of irregular warfare activities in our country. But to 2022, yeah. They're certainly pushing. They're trying to primary any Republican who didn't go along with the Trump program, and any Republican who resisted the anti-democratic attempt to invalidate the election. 2024, they're hoping to drop. Trump's making noise. Maybe people think he's going to run again. I don't know. I bet he's had enough, to be honest with you, and he's probably going to get tripped up by a lot of the lawsuits that are out there now. But you could drop somebody else into that machine, and I think they're trying to figure out who that might be. Somebody more dangerous than Trump. That's the scary part.